And finally, the last of this series on the new movement in solidarity with the Mexican Revolution is political conclusion and summary. All of the previously outlined proposals, no matter how well-intentioned, still accept the legitimacy of the border and the theft of northern Mexico, as well as the basic economic and political system of the United States. They all offer reforms to bad domestic and foreign government policies, bad government institutions, or bad laws and personnel without challenging the U.S. imperialist system itself. We have described in this pamphlet how Mexico achieved its independence from Spain after 300 years of Spanish colonization and became a sovereign nation in 1821. White settlements in northern Mexico began as early as 1819 as the U.S. encouraged settling in this area, coveting the land and rich resources. In Texas, Anglo settlers rebelled and then seceded in 1836, joining the United States in 1845. Through the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48 and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the point of a gun, the U.S. seized and occupied the northern 51% of Mexico. It was at this point that a border was imposed to divide not only a northern and southern Mexico, but the Mexican people as well. For those of us in the new movement, it is not a question of Mexican migrants achieving United States citizenship, nor is it a question of increasing the quota, fair preference systems, or amnesty programs. We do not recognize the illegitimately imposed border. What today the U.S. calls the Southwest, the states of Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, is in fact the occupied northern territories of Mexico. We do not recognize the right of the U.S. to establish a border based upon the conquest and theft of a sovereign nation. The militarily imposed border helps to perpetuate the colonization of 20 million Mexicans in the occupied territories and of the dependent capitalist state of Mexico. To the south, most Mexicans live in extreme poverty. Their labor and vast resources have gone to enrich a corrupt and repressive Mexican ruling class, as well as U.S. and other foreign corporations. Liberal proposals aimed at restricting migration to the U.S. by supplying more foreign aid to Mexico and other third world countries ignores the reality that the U.S. policy toward them has always been based upon U.S. corporate profit, not the needs of their people. Foreign aid and U.S. investment, which benefits only a minority, has created corruption and dependence. North of the border, 20 million Mexicans face unemployment, poor housing and medical care, and police terror in their communities. Well over 2,000 third world people were killed by police during the last 10 years. According to the U.S. government statistics, in 1972, Mexican family income was only 71% of Anglo family income. Remember, this was in the 1980s that this was written. A decade later, that figure had fallen to 68%. 30% of Mexicans in the United States live below the official poverty line, twice the U.S. average, as do one of every two third world children in the United States. In 1983, the government claimed 15.7% of Mexicans and over 30% of Mexican teenagers were unemployed. Although this is greatly understated, only half the number of third world children as white children graduate from high school. All of these statistics do little to actually convey the daily human toll of colonialism. There is now a proposed bill that would make English the official U.S. language. This is yet another step in the 135 years of U.S. efforts to break Mexican resistance in the occupied territories and to destroy the Mexican identity as one people by suppressing their language, history, and traditions. We agree with the position of the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional Mexicano that says that Mexicans have the right to migrate freely from the southern to the northern territories. We also agree with their perspective that the best strategy for the liberation of the Mexican people, both north and south, is the reunification of the occupied territories with the rest of Mexico in a socialist republic of Mexico. We support this as a way that Mexicans can gain control over their lands and lives. For us, it is not a question of Mexicans achieving U.S. citizenship, but of the Mexican people's right to self-determination, including their right to reclaim their homeland. This will involve a struggle against both the repressive governments of Mexico and the United States and the establishment of a new social system based upon human needs rather than corporate profits. We consider the INS an army in the occupied territories whose primary purpose is to control the Mexican people. Since the border was imposed, the U.S. has had to continue to use military force, not only to maintain this border, but to secure the occupied territories. The INS is simply the current military and legal form of organization that the United States is employing. At the border, La Migra uses sophisticated counterinsurgency technology and techniques to maintain control of this area. It acts in cooperation with other law enforcement agencies in investigation, apprehension, detention, and deportation of Mexicans and others. Within the occupied territories, it selectively conducts raids when there is political organizing and strikes, just as its predecessors, the Texas Rangers, terrorized Mexicans to gain control of their land and squash their resistance. INS officers today terrorize Mexican communities by their continuous presence in an attempt to intimidate and repress Mexican resistance to their colonial conditions. Regardless of how sensitive any particular INS agent may be or how ethically he or she adheres to agency rules and regulations, they are still members of an occupying army whose role is to enforce an historical injustice. The United States is a white European settler nation which was established through the theft of lands of Native Americans and Mexican peoples. Even despite the seizure of lands rich in resources, the great wealth of the United States could not have been amassed from white working people alone. It required the blood and labor of millions of Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and indigenous peoples, both inside and outside the United States borders. The enslavement and forced labor of the African people on southern plantations created the foundations of the economy in that area, as did the labor of the Chinese and Mexicans in the West. This is apparent in the fact that if California was a nation, it would be the fifth richest nation in the world. Much of their wealth was built by the labor of third world people, appealing to the U.S. for fair immigration policies for third world people or for more government services is at best naive idealism. Throughout history, the U.S. has had no need for third world people other than as a source of cheap, exploitable labor, or as in the case of the people admitted from the communist nations, as an excuse to unleash a barrage of anti-communist propaganda. Immigration laws and policies have consistently reflected this. Capitalism is an economic, political, and social system in which all of the decisions about how society will operate are based on what will make profits, not on what will benefit people collectively. Any system based on profits is a system which must control and exploit the world's resources, labor, and markets. The U.S. is a country which has 6% of the world's population, but consumes over half of the world's resources. But even this is somewhat incomplete because in the stage of imperialism, the world has become divided up into a few highly developed industrialized nations like the U.S., the Western Europe nations, and Japan, and the overwhelming majority of the world's nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the occupied territories of Mexico and the internal colonies of the United States are kept systematically impoverished and underdeveloped. This superdevelopment and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin. Wealth flows out of the third world and into advanced capitalist nations, giving U.S. and worldwide imperialism its strength. This is as true today through United States control over the world economy and its support for third world dictatorships as it was when the U.S. empire was first founded. National liberation movements pose a threat to the U.S. and worldwide imperialism. It has been the national liberation movements from Vietnam to Zimbabwe to Nicaragua that have actually succeeded in defeating imperialism and which have begun the long process of building new socialist societies to replace the colonial domination of their nations. They have proven that despite all the hype, imperialism is not invincible, and that the U.S. empire, which has risen, will also fall in time like the other empires before it, because it is based on fundamental injustice. National liberation movements have provided strategic leadership to us by showing that even the most technologically sophisticated army in history can be defeated by a protracted people's war, by a massive political and military mobilization, an organization which builds slowly over time through stages as conditions change. As national liberation movements continue to win and the U.S. empire increasingly loses control over the world's nations and resources, it is moving into a deeper and deeper economic crisis. To reassert its domination in the world, the U.S. is planning and participating in war, eventually probably leading to a third world war. To carry out this war, the U.S. is attempting to create a loyal population at home through a fascist mobilization based on patriotism, white supremacy, and repression. They were saying this in the 80s already. The scapegoating of migrants and the immigrants is part of the process, which encourages North America to see third world people as the source of our problem. But the statements of top government and business leaders that the U.S. should fight in Central America today, or it will have to fight on its borders tomorrow, are not merely inflammatory rhetoric. They reflect the understanding that the impact of revolutionary movements in the region will not be limited to those nations themselves, but will rock the very foundation of the United States. Above all, it is Mexico that the U.S. must control, only in part because of its tremendous economic stake there. Equally as important, the revolutionary movement in Mexico will continue making connections to revolutionary organizations here, helping to mobilize the 20 million Mexicans north of the border, as well as their allies, to fight the U.S. from within its borders. In this context, that the U.S. pours more and more money into building up and reinforcing INS troops and military technology. At all costs, the U.S. will try to control the border and the occupied territories and attempt to prevent the further development of revolutionary forces inside the heart of the empire. This poses very sharp choices for all of us. We hope that this pamphlet will help not only in understanding the issue of migration, but also in building a North American solidarity movement with the Mexican struggle and all oppressed people. We believe that this movement must support the right of Mexicans and all oppressed nations to self-determination. We also believe that for it to be effective, it must be an anti-imperialist movement that goes beyond electoral politics, legislative reforms, and the supporting someone else's struggle attitude. The destruction of imperialism is a prerequisite for the building of a humane society for all of us. I'm thinking about Gaza right now. Ultimately, the deepest expression of North American solidarity comes when we recognize the role that we have to play in building a movement among North Americans that fights on all levels just as seriously against imperialism as do the national liberation movements we support. And that concludes this series. That was a lot. I think it's so relevant to what's going on still today, 40 years later, at the border, and how the U.S. does what it needs to do to get what it needs all over the world. All over the world. We need to break the system and restart it. The power of the people is greater than the people in power.